guys, welcome to the Cosplay Stitch and Seam! This week's episode is going to be done a little bit differently. This is VFire here, aka Mercedes. So I'm in the middle of moving and don't have much time to actually record with Pannon, and so we're doing kind of like a separate episode where I'm recording the first half and she's recording the second half, and it's kind of lonely without her doing it this way, so I don't know if we'll do this often. If you want to send us your cosplay horror stories or even happy stories, make sure you email us at cosplaystitchandseam@gmail.com or visit our website at cosplaystitchandseam.com, and you can fill out the form there, you can say hello, you can also join the Facebook group, and as always, there's a lot of fun stuff usually happening on there. People are asking for advice, helping each other out, sharing really cool progress photos. I absolutely love it. Also, I want to give a shout out to Joy D for donating to our coffee account. That was pretty awesome. If you want to donate to us, you just need to go to ko-fi.com/coffee for cosplay seams, with the 4 being the number 4. And yeah, you can. All that money goes towards just kind of helping maintain the website and the podcast subscriptions each month. And yeah, really appreciate that. Joy D, you're awesome. Thank you so much. You're a beautiful individual, and we love you. All right. So today's episode, since we don't have a ton of time for each of us, we're going to go over our favorite cosplay materials. Now, my favorite cosplay materials, if you haven't noticed, I really enjoy working with leather, and so that's going to be my number 1, I think. I just think it's a very forgivable material. It's really easy to work with. There's a lot of really interesting ways that you can use it. It can be flexible. You can harden it. You can carve it or sculpt it almost to a point. Leather's just a really fun medium, and so that has got to be my number 1. Tools that I use with leather. They can be kind of pricey. I mean, leather itself can be kind of pricey. And so my advice for if you wanted to go into leatherworking would be to start collecting tools kind of one at a time. So for example, I got some really cool leather shears. I highly recommend them. Most people start with a box cutter, or just simple box cutting tools. Those are actually a really good way to start. And if you find that you really like it, keep going, and you can purchase more expensive tools later. There we go. I can words today. I run a podcast, right? Yeah. That's actually generally a good thing. Good advice for most tools is buy a cheap version of the tool first, and if you find that you're using it to the point where it breaks, purchase one that afterwards that does cost a little bit more, because you know that you're going to use it and it's going to be worth it. And that definitely goes for leather tools. With leather tools, you want to make sure you get the right types as well. You don't want to use an actual hammer on your embossing tools. You want to use a wood mallet or a hide mallet or even a plastic mallet, but not a metal hammer or a rubber mallet. Mostly because the rubber mallet just gets destroyed. Talking from experience. Yup. Let's see. I really like leather because you can harden it, is one of the main things. So I usually will color or dye my leather first before hardening it into a shape, depending on how I need to color it, of course. But you can just do that by just getting it wet and carefully baking it, whether you use an oven or a heat gun. I usually make heat gun ovens, essentially, where I have a box and I line it with tin foil and I heat it up in there, and that really helps get it evenly heated where it needs to be, and then I'll lay it on top of something that I want it to be that shape, and eventually the leather will kind of stay in that shape. And of course, if you do it too much, you end up cooking the leather, which isn't good because it makes it brittle and crack and all that stuff. So it's a nice fine balance that you figure out as you go. Let's see, what else do I like about leather? Dyeing it is fun. You can get official leather dyes that dye your fingers too, but they're really good. Wear plastic gloves, guys. Wear plastic gloves, or you're gonna look like, you murdered something if you're dyeing something red. I use a technique that I call the poor man's dye. It really helps me with getting very custom colors, and because a lot of my work looks like it's aged and used, this method works really well. If you want something that looks brand new, this is probably not a great method to use, as it doesn't quite give it that new look. But I'll just buy cheap acrylics from like Walmart. I get a bowl out, I pour a little bit of the color that I want in it, and then I just put a bunch of water in it. Usually the water is, I don't know, I say like a thumbprint's worth of paint and maybe about half an inch worth of water in one of those like red solo bowls. Yeah, and then you just mix that with a paintbrush and then get it so that the water and paint ratio is very well mixed together, and then I just kind of lay that out on some leather, let it dry, and then I see if that's the color that I want, and then I'll just like start custom coloring it. For Aloy has, I did her, what's that armor called? Karja Blazon heavy armor, and there are over 60 leather pieces that went into that all had to be dyed this very custom pinkish red color. Like, it was a pain to get that shade. And once I got that shade, I was like, okay, now I need to dye everything this color because I don't know if I'm going to get this specific shade again. And so my friend Sadie and I actually sat down and we just were putting on coats and coats and coats of this. And because of this method, it's not really vibrant, the first layer that you put on, so we had to do layer after layer after layer, and all I had was this one bowl of this color. And so it took us the better part of a day to get all the pieces with that nice vibrant pinkish red in the middle. And it was worth it. It was worth it because I got the exact color that I wanted. It looks great. It doesn't feel too pink. It doesn't feel too red. And even though it took a long time, I was really happy with it. So that's how I do the poor man's version of dyeing. And again, it makes it look a little bit more aged than if you were to do like a bot dye, like one of those official ones that they have, where it dyes your fingers kind of thing. Let's see. Leather's also great for making like scabbards and sheaths for swords and knives and stuff like that. I've done one of those, and I want to make more, of course. My first one, it turned out alright. Like, I'm really proud of it. I really am. The clamps that I used on it, though, added little dents all down it, which I just kind of like disguised as part of the texture, but I want to avoid that next time, so I'm going to use like a flat piece of wood and then put the clamps over the top of it so I don't get clamp marks all down my scabbard again. But that was another example of like getting the leather wet, and I wrapped it around the blade, and then carefully took a heat gun around it to help it dry into the shape of being wrapped around my sword. But I had to do that carefully because I didn't want to damage my sword. Luckily, my sword was mostly made out of wood materials, so it wasn't super heat sensitive, but the handle had like warbler and stuff in it. Speaking of materials I like to use, I love using wood as well. And I know a lot of conventions are starting to ban wooden weapons, which is really unfortunate because it's such a versatile material. There's so much you can do with it. There's really cool shapes you can make with it, and it's also a lot cheaper than a lot of the materials out there. Also, like, if you're like sharpening a sword, getting that nice angle on it using a bandsaw, or not a bandsaw, a belt sander, you kind of feel like, I don't know, like you're sharpening a real blade, and it feels pretty badass. Yeah, so wood swords are usually my MO. I've started going into acrylics, because a lot of conventions do allow light plastics, and acrylic blades work very similar. They're a lot harder to get that smooth texture afterwards. Smooth texture, I don't think lack of texture afterwards. But it is still doable, and you can still get a nice light blade. They are a lot more fragile, though. Case in point, when I broke my sword from Madoka because I sat on it. If I'd sat on a wooden blade of the same type, I probably would have cracked it, but it probably wouldn't have split in half like the other one did. Yeah, I really like wood. It's just really nice to work with. You gotta wear a mask, of course, especially if you're using anything like MDF board. You want to have a respirator because that has very toxic materials in it. What else about wood do I like? Wooden props are awesome. My favorite materials, as far as like wood goes, is usually, let's say pine and poplar. Poplar is really nice because it's super smooth. Usually lays pretty flat, so I usually don't have to change too much in it, and it doesn't have knots in it. Pine I like because it smells good. It smells amazing. It does have knots in it though, which is really great when I'm making like legit wooden swords, like Link's wooden sword from Twilight Princess is made out of pine. And I wanted to have like that wood grain. Pine has a really nice wood grain to it usually, and you just have to be aware of the knots, because the knots can split your project if you hit it just right, and that's a big no-no. But if you get like a good knot in the right spot, it can look really neat. Knots eventually over time kind of dry up and will fall out, and so you want to keep an eye on that as well. But there's ways that you can seal it in by like covering, if you really want that texture to be there, you can cover it with like a resin or something, and that'll help keep it in place. My Shadow of the Colossus sword is made out of poplar, and the base of it is anyways, and I made it extra smooth by covering it in fiberglass resin. None of the fiberglass like fabric-y stuff that you put on there, the glassy texture-y stuff, I just did just the resin. And I did a couple layers of that, gave it a little bit of time to like sit between each. I think every 2 hours you can add another layer of fiberglass resin with a particular one that I was using. And then once it had its 24 hours to fully cure, I went outside and I sanded and sanded and sanded until it was super smooth. And then I covered the whole blade in aluminum tape. Aluminum tape also is another really cool material. I want to throw that one in there too, for making a very shiny surface, as well as if you sand it just right, it can look like worn metal. So when I did my Shadow of the Colossus blade, I laid out the tape on top, and it actually had the aluminum tape that I purchased, the widest that I could find, had 3M printed all over it, and I was like, oh no, I hope this will come off. Otherwise I have a 3M Colossus sword. And I laid out the tape on it, very carefully trimmed it and whatnot, and it was this beautiful 3M sword. And then I took, what is it called? It's steel wool. There we go. Steel wool. And I used that to sand the 3M off, and I did like little circles as I went down it, and it made this really cool texture and made the sword look like it was made out of metal versus just being really shiny aluminum tape. I actually really recommend that if you use aluminum tape, go over it with some steel wool and just kind of like add these lines to it, create this nice texture, because then it looks more like steel than shiny tape. It really, really adds to that. Yeah, and then I went through with some harsher sandpaper. So steel wool is like 1,000 grit steel wool, I think. And then I went with some 60 grit sandpaper and just put these like gashes in it. And then took a black and brown and a little bit of green paint all mixed together. Did a wash of that over the top of the blade and then wiped it off, so that way all those little scratches and things would pop out. And I mean, in Shadow of the Colossus, he's stabbing mountains, and so I wanted the sword to look super beat up. And I think I succeeded in making it look really beat up. Yeah, so there's some really cool tricks there. Yeah, I think I went over essentially my two favorite materials, and I think that's it for my time on this. Let's see, cosplay horror story before I go. I did think of another one the other day. I don't think I've shared this one yet. So one time, this is when I was very, very beginning of cosplaying, and I did actually decide to use a pattern. And so I was making Fai's coat from Tsubasa, and I'd laid out all my fabric and whatnot, and it was like, okay, I'm going to try this pattern out. This pattern is a cloak pattern, and, you know, maybe I'll figure out how to use patterns this time, right? So I'm laying everything out, and the reason that I had the space to do this at this time was because I was cat sitting for my aunt. And she let me use, like, because she was out of town and whatnot, I had, like, her whole house to myself and her cat. And Snowball he's an adorable cat. He's really cute. He hates socks. So don't wear socks around him. He will attack your feet. But if you're not wearing socks, he's totally fine with you. So I had laid out my pattern and was like figuring out how to make everything fit on this piece of fabric that I had. Completely doing it wrong, of course, because I didn't know about grain lines in fabric, but that's for another time. And as I'm like trying to trace out this pattern and get ready to cut it out, I hear this chewing noise, and I'm like, what is that? I look up, and the cat is eating my pattern. And I go, no, and he takes off with the pattern in his mouth. And so, well, I had to do some doctoring on that pattern to figure out how the heck it went back together. So yeah, cats like to eat pattern paper, apparently, especially Snowball. And be warned of that. Anyways, I'm going to hand over the time to Pannon. So Pannon, it is your turn. Thanks, guys!
Thanks, Mercedes. So hello again this week. It's just me on this end. Sorry, it's so separated. I hope Mercedes is having good luck with getting her house in order and moving to new places and hopefully new workspaces, so that'll be fun. I have basically compiled just a list of the basics for me, instead of like specifically stuff I like a lot. I have some of that, but also just like the basics that really came in handy for me. And also I wanted to like mention, I hope this like episode doesn't come off as a commercial, because we've both like taken pains to not use like brand names in any of this. You can find a brand that works for you. It doesn't have to be any set brand. It's more the tool that we're talking about, or the fabric, or the materials, etc. So, like, don't feel beholden to any one brand. We're not sponsored or affiliated with anybody. La la la. These are literally just, like, our personal favorite things. So, to start out with, I put organizational bins, big and small. You're gonna have especially if you're planning on cosplaying a lot or making a lot of props, or even like if you're just making parts of your costume and buying others, chances are good you're gonna want a place to store all this stuff because it's not out all the time, hopefully. So having storage bins in a multitude of sizes, clear bins are really nice because then you can see what's inside. The smaller ones are great for fabric notions, for little tools, for scraps of things that you have left over, stuff like that. As for fabrics, these are literally just like a list of my favorite fabrics and why I'm using them. So my favorite one is cotton sateen. I like that one a lot because it has a decent weight to it. It has a slight sheen, and it's great for most of like the everyday costumes if you're not like sure on the setting, or if you just want something that has a nice weight to it and is good for solid colors. Cotton sateen's it just looks nice. Obviously you're going to want to cater your project to whatever time period or whatever clothing item you're making. Like, you probably don't want to use cotton sateen if you're making like a workout uniform or like a fancy ball gown. You might. I've done cotton sateen for ball gowns, but it just depends on what you want. But I found it to be a really good, really easy to work with, and it's still like I said, it still has a nice finished look to it. It doesn't look like just cotton. It has that slight sheen. It can take dyes pretty well. It does have a little bit of poly to it, but it can take dyes reasonably well. So yeah, it's a good workable one. I also really like suede. I use it a lot for, I do a lot of like crossplay characters, and one of my favorites is Link from Legend of Zelda, and he's always got like a million belts. And suede is really good for like faking a leather look if you can't go out and buy leather. Like Mercedes loves to buy leather. I like suede because it's a little more forgiving. Leather is pretty thick, and it definitely does its job, but you want something that you can use on your home machine. Maybe try suede. You don't require quite as many tools up front to start working with it, and you still get a leather-ish look. Suede is also good if you're doing like I don't know, like high-ranking nobility or like a character you want to feel fancy. It's like a step below velvet sort of a thing, or I don't want to say manlier alternative to velvet, but it does have like a more masculine character vibe to it, I guess. I don't know that. I lost my train of thought, but basically it's good when you like want to make something that still feels rich and fancy, but maybe can't afford the nicest materials. Suede is a fun option, and also it's gonna wear really well. Like, it's going to last. It stands up to a lot of punishment, stuff like that. Next on list is lycra. Lycra or spandex blends are going to be invaluable in your learning on fabric manipulation, basically. They are a pain in the butt, I'm going to say straight off. Like, if you have only worked with basically natural weave fabrics and you go into a stretch, it is going to be a little bit of a pain, and it definitely has a learning curve. But the nice thing about lycra or spandex or whatever is that you don't have to worry as much about fit. It's a really forgiving fabric, despite how hard it is to use. Like, you can make something that's like kind of off in a few places and it'll still look nice when you put it on. And then it's also great for working with and using with armored pieces. I see a lot more these days. I see people using the like stretching your fabric over the armor to give the appearance of leather, to give the appearance of like metallic, things like that. Different spandexes can be used in a lot of different ways, not just for clothing. It can be like cool armor and prop and things like that. So yeah, learning how to use lycra and stretch fabrics, super valuable. I also have stretch taffeta. I really like that one, but that's because I like taffeta and not everybody does. Taffeta has like a sheen to it. It looks really nice on stage and stuff like that. And the stretch element is going to make your fitting a little bit easier. When I say stretch taffeta, it doesn't mean it stretches like as much as spandex. It just means that it's a little bit forgiving. Kind of like a pair of stretch denim pants, or jeans, rather. A pair of like stretch denim would be like the stretch taffeta, and a pair of like actual jeggings is going to be more like spandex. So stretch taffeta, stretch sateen, things like that do have a little bit more body to them. They're a little bit more durable, but they can still give you a really nice fit without quite as much pain in the butt as spandex. And then my last one is one of my favorite fancy fabrics to work with, is like a dupioni silk. Dupioni has to do with like the weave of the fabric. You'll kind of like see it has little like imperfections and bumps and things, but they also work to like catch the light and look really pretty from far away. And they also like give a really nice texture up close, so it isn't just a solid plane of color. You see like a lot of like little textural things up close. So it's just something that's fun and exciting for the eye to look at. I've used it with like Princess Serenity was one of the ones I used it with, and it's just a really pretty fabric, and it's fun to work with, and it's, you know, a natural weave, so it's not that difficult to work with. It just can be a little intimidating because it's silk and it's expensive. So fabrics aside, the next thing I had was, what are you using to manipulate your fabrics? So you want a machine that can handle the basics. You want something that can at least do a straight stitch and a zigzag. Having those two that work really well on your machine is going to save you a lot of pain. If you have a fancier one that can do buttonhole settings, that can do zipper feet, if you have something that can do, what's another foot? A walking foot. Those are all super helpful still, but just having the basics is really going to help you out and get you started. I also suggest looking into a basic serger. If you're looking at using stretch fabrics on the regular, you'll want to have a serger, because a straight stitch machine, even if it can do zigzag, is just not quite going to cut it. A serger gives you a stitch that is called an overlock, and it is made to stretch. That's basically the point of a serged seam, is it can stretch without major popping. So it's basically the point is that a serged seam can stretch. Your next thing would be, I suggest a hand sewing kit and familiarizing yourself with different ways to do hand stitching. Some people will just kind of attack it in the way that makes sense to them. Like, oh, if I just, loop it over this way, or like weave it between here and there. But try looking up what like actual couture or just hand stitching finishes, slip stitches, overlock stitches, not overlock, but you know what I mean, whip stitch, different stitch styles and what they're used for are really going to help you out. Next up, getting yourself a set of pins, some chalk, or you can also use like Sharpies or those magic heat pens, and a ruler are all going to be really helpful in cutting things out. Cutting things out is the basis for every sewing project you're working on. If it's not the shape you want when you cut it out, you're going to have a harder time getting it to the shape you want when you're sewing it. So the more you can do in your prep work, the easier time you're going to have in your other work. The less fixing and all those things you're going to have to do. Next up, this is one I'm still learning on, but I really have enjoyed, is resin. Resin, it just has a lot of different applications in cosplay, and I still feel like I'm only scratching the surface because I've really only used the kits, but even just that, I feel like I've really learned a lot and been able to put it towards a lot of different useful things in cosplay. So getting yourself like a resin kit, looking up tutorials online, like what I'm going to be doing is looking into the more industrial ones, the non-clear resins, the quicker set resins, things like that. I'd really like to get into, but you can also dye resin with different, like you can use food coloring, but there's also specific like brand dyes. So just finding something that works and is fun for you. I had like a weekend where I just went through and tried a bunch of different paints and different like clear gels and things like that to see how it would affect resin in different ways. And it was like kind of costly, but it was still a really fun learning experience. And I kind of know now like what projects I can use what for. So just spend some time and play with that. You can also get different molds and tools. I am a fan of going to the baking department of your craft stores, and any of those silicone molds that you see, like for melted chocolates and things like that. Definitely suggest getting the silicone ones and not the clear plastic ones. But the silicone molds you can use with resin. Like, it is basically the same as getting a resin mold. So just have fun with those, build all kinds of fun things. It's great. Next on my list is getting a set of jewelry pliers and cutters. I cannot tell you how many times this has been useful, even if I'm not using them on jewelry, having a tiny set of pliers, having a tiny set of cutters, because you just get so many odd materials, and having something that can like get in there and do the nitty-gritty is super helpful. I also have my last major one, one of my favorites, I guess, especially for hat making, is plastic canvas. Plastic canvas is that stuff that like you'll go to the craft store in the yarn section, and it's like a sheet. It looks like a grid paper, but it's just the lines, and it's made of plastic. And people use it for a lot of like yarn hook sort of things, but it actually works really great for hat making, for keeping things stiff that need to be stiff. And you can heat it up and shape it if you need to. But that's basically my go-to for hats, for weird props, for things that need to be light. I make all my wizard hats brims out of that as a base. I use it for, I made like some Victorian hats out of that. I made my shower on hat out of that. I don't know, it's just super easy to use, and you can sew multiple sheets of it together, just using like a zigzag stitch on your machine. So yeah, it's super nice, and that's my list of different things that materials and stuff I would suggest. Oh, as a last note, I would say also to save your garbage fabric. Within reason. I save all my pieces that are like a yard or more, even if it's not for a project I'm going to be looking at again, just because I can use it for mock-ups. I always like to be able to test fabrics for a new project if I can. You can also, you can buy, muslin or bleached muslin and use that for projects, which it does still work, but it's less expensive in the long run if you can use leftover fabric. I will say using your leftovers can also give you more variety in what you're making mock-ups of, because you don't want to use a cotton mock-up for something you're going to make out of stretch, because you're going to have a very different fit. So yeah, just keeping stuff that you can mess around with. Yeah. Let's see. So that's really it for my list of materials. Please feel free on the Facebooks. We'll start up a post and ask you guys what's your favorite materials to use. In regards to the Facebook group, just wanted to say huge thank you to everyone who commented on ideas for this coming year. We have a bounty basically to work with. There are so many fun topics, and we're super excited to get started on those for this year. And I hope you guys will stick with us and keep commenting, keep having fun in the community. We always like seeing what you're working on, seeing what topics are important to you, and doing our best to discuss and represent those. Cosplay horror stories. So we received a whole bunch of stories from one of our listeners, Claudia, and we're probably going to spread these out across a couple of weeks. So here is one of her stories. It says, "This one is not so much an embarrassing story for me, but more like me being kind of a little brat. At a convention in 2016 or 17, whatever year, my boyfriend and I were about 5 people away from entering the venue and bag check area after waiting in one of their more mild lines when a man came out of nowhere and stood by the line. He was carrying 3 bags and a lot of photography equipment. He may have had a premiere or press pass, but after what he did, I did not care what type of pass he had. Little by little, he eased himself into the line. I noticed this behavior and mentally thought, he's not thinking of cutting, is he? But I smiled to myself and kept silent. I don't think my boyfriend noticed the inner tension either. Right after the group in front of us got their bags checked and entered, the guy stepped in front of me and my boyfriend and started picking up his equipment. Without skipping a beat, I rushed past him and slammed my purse down on the check table, practically at the hands of the innocent high school-aged volunteer, who was probably okay. The photographer gave me a WTF gesture like he was some sort of victim. I didn't give a crap and told my boyfriend to give me his backpack too. The volunteer just proceeded to check our bags, and we went in. I don't care if you have a press pass, photography pass, cosplay famous pass, representative of Congress pass, get in your own line and don't sneak in front of people who were waiting an hour and a half. I mean, that's a really rough one. I feel like for a lot of these bigger events, you really have to have a specialized line for if you're doing press and guests and things like that. Because it looks really unfair to the people who have been waiting in line when other people get to just jump ahead like that. And I've been on both sides of this, and it I don't know, if I ever have jumped a line, even if it's with staff who are no, we have to get you to an event, I feel super crummy about it. But I really like when they are able to have a separate back line, and I think it looks a little more professional personally. But yeah, I'm sorry about that, and we'll probably get to some of the other stories in the upcoming weeks. I will say though, kudos for being kind to staff in this, because it's not their fault ever. They are just following the rules they were given, and so it always helps to be kind to staff, so thanks for that. Just remember, you can send us your cosplay horror stories at cosplaystitchandseam@gmail.com or on the form spring on our website, cosplaystitchandseam.com. You can check us out. Mercedes made this really cute new banner, so it has all of our contact stuff on that. You can catch us now on Instagram and Twitter. You can follow us. It's at Cosplay Stitch, all one word. So just a little ampersand Cosplay Stitch. And that's on Instagram or Twitter. You can find us on our website, cosplaystitchandseam.com, all one word. Or at our email, cosplaystitchandseam@gmail.com, or on that Facebook group I mentioned. And of course, we are always looking for your inspiring stories, your horror stories, your questions, if you need advice. We just like hearing from you guys, and it's been awesome. We do have our Ko-fi account that just helps us keep going from month to month. We do cover it out of our own pocket, but when we receive your donations, it really helps us out and helps us, it just helps us stay afloat, so we don't have to pay so much out of pocket, and we can put more toward, improving on and making the podcast better. And that is Ko-fi for the number 4 Cosplay Seams. So Ko-fi for Cosplay Seams. And you can make a donation there. Even if it's just a couple bucks, it really helps us out. I wanted to, again, thank Joy D this week. She gave us enough for like an entire month of covering our bandwidth fees. So huge thank you to Joy D for that. We super appreciate it. Thank you, as always, to David Jeffress of Comic Trades Monthly and Dungeons and Chill. So if you want to check out either of his podcasts, they are definitely worthy of your time. We've had a couple of people say, I binged listened to your series. Like, what do you suggest? I suggest David's podcasts, Dungeons and Chill, Comic Trades Monthly. They're a lot of fun. You can also thank Macy Roberts for our audio every week, our cute little intro song. And last but not least is quote for the week by me. This is embarrassing to do like by myself alone in a room, but here's my stupid pun for the week. Don't be swayed by our materials. Resin it out for yourself and find what would be best for you. Leather or not, it's one of our faves. Bye, guys. Hope you enjoyed this week. And hopefully we'll get to banter a little more back and forth next week. We're doing a recap rundown of our time at Anime Los Angeles just a week or two ago. Hope you'll join us for that. And until next time, bye.